Across much of recorded history, marriage involved a payment between two families, and the amount was public. Silver, land, livestock, furniture, cattle counted out one by one. Which side handed it over depended on how that society made its money. Sometimes her family paid his, sometimes his family paid hers, but some form of property or payment often changed hands, and the families involved knew the figure. Her father sat down with his father. The two of them argued over it in front of witnesses. A scribe or a notary wrote it down, and after that, there was a wedding. Babylon worked that way. So did Athens, Rome, Florence, London, and Delhi last week. Almost nobody was embarrassed by it, because the reason was simple enough to say at a table. Marriage moved a person from one household into another, and that move changed what each household could earn and what it had to spend. So the families settled up. This concerns you for one reason. Maybe you believe marriage was always a free exchange between two people in love, and money only crawled into it recently through prenups and divorce lawyers. Believe that, and every hesitation you've ever felt looks like a defect in you. You'll think you're being cheap or scared or not enough of a man. For most of the written record, fathers treated that exact hesitation as the first item of business and treated the conversation about it as ordinary adult behavior. Being wrong about this costs you the ability to ask a question out loud. And a man who can't ask what he's taking on tends to sign whatever gets put in front of him, then find out the terms afterward. Roughly 3,700 years ago, a scribe in Babylon carved the rules into a block of black stone and stood it up where people could read it. The Code of Hammurabi spends dozens of its laws on the property a father sent along with his daughter. Who holds it while the marriage lasts? Who gets it if she dies? What happens to it if he throws her out? The same stone that sets the penalty for a builder whose house collapses also sets out what her family owed the man who took her in. Notice where that carving stood, out in the open, where the people governed by those laws could walk up and read them. In Athens, a girl with no money attached to her had a hard time marrying, and everybody said so in public. Rich men were praised in court speeches for putting up dowries for the daughters of poor relatives. That was how you bought a reputation for generosity in that city. The fund followed her into the marriage and generally went back to her father's house if the marriage ended, with interest running if the husband dragged his feet. That return rule was her family's grip on him. He lived off that money. So mistreating her carried a cost he could count. The arrangement remained enforceable long after the ceremony, and disputes over it could end up before jurors. Each of these places shows the same two things. Marriage moved money between families, and the people involved named the amount in the open. Rome wrote it down more carefully than most societies before or since. The dose came from her side. The husband held and used it while they were married, and when the marriage ended, he handed it back. He could keep 1/6 for each child, up to half the total. He could keep more if she'd been unfaithful. There were courts to hear him argue about the split. Worth being exact about one thing, because the exactness makes it sharper. In many of these societies, the man never got a bag of silver to spend on himself. He held it, worked the land it came as, ran the household on it, and answered for it if the marriage broke. People rarely build return clauses, interest terms, and retention rules around a gift. Those get built around something priced. The Roman husband was managing an asset tied to an obligation under supervision with penalties for failing. It had something close to performance terms, and Rome ran it that way for centuries, where everyone could see it. Florence, 1425. The city government opened a public fund for dowries. A father deposited money while his daughter was small. The city held it and paid interest, and on her wedding day the accumulated sum went to the husband. Thousands of accounts were opened. Under the fund's early terms, If the girl died before marrying, the city kept the deposit. Sit with what that father is doing. His daughter is 5 years old, and he is walking into a government office to start saving for the sum a man will expect in order to take her into his household 15 years later. He's pre-funding a figure he already knows will come up. And in some cities, prices climbed. The way prices climb when a lot of families are bidding for the same limited supply of acceptable matches. Florentine and Venetian households started running the numbers a different way. A convent asked for an entry gift too, and that gift often ran well below what a marriage would take. A fair number of daughters went to convents. In Venice, by the 1600s, a striking share of noble women of marrying age ended up behind convent walls, and historians tend to find the reason in family finances at least as often as in anybody's religious feelings. Fathers weighed marrying a daughter off against the cheaper option, and marriage was the expensive one. Stop for a second and put yourself inside that arithmetic. Ask what would have happened in your last relationship if her father had been expected to show up with a figure in daylight in front of both families before anybody discussed a date. In England, the solicitors handled it. Months before a respectable wedding in 1810, 2 lawyers exchanged letters settling the marriage articles, the portion coming in from her father, and the jointure the groom's estate guaranteed her if he died first. Specific fields were named. Specific sums were named. The couple were occasionally the last 2 people to hear the final terms. That's the piece to hold on to. The wedding was a celebration attached to an agreement that had already been argued, drafted, and signed by professionals, and every relative in the church had a rough idea what was in it. Whatever love existed sat on top of a document about money, and nobody found that scandalous enough to hide. And this isn't dead practice you can file under history. India outlawed dowry in 1961, and across much of the country, the payments carried on regardless. Gold, cash, a car, the entire wedding covered by her side. There's a rough rate sheet underneath it that everyone involved understands. A groom with a secure government job costs more than one without. An engineer costs more than a clerk, a doctor costs more than an engineer, and a man with a foreign visa costs more than all of them. India's own crime figures still record thousands of dowry deaths a year, women killed or driven to kill themselves, over payments that stayed unpaid after the wedding. Being precise here matters more than being sweeping. None of this makes the arrangement good. In many of these societies, she was the item being placed, frequently at 14, frequently to a man she'd met twice. And the Indian numbers are what happens when a price hardens into a debt somebody can be killed over. There were also plenty of households in every one of these places where the money was close to a formality, and 2 people simply liked each other. The narrower version survives all of that. In these societies, both families accepted that marriage moved money, and they argued about it where other people could hear, which is exactly where somebody watching this starts pushing back, and it's the right place to push. You'd say I'm flattening marriage into a transaction. Thousands of years of weddings, and I'm describing them like a used car lot. A price on the marriage never made it a cold marriage. Those 2 things sat on top of each other constantly. A Roman couple could have their dues negotiated by their fathers and still spend 40 years fond of each other. An English bride whose portion was drafted by solicitors could be in love with the man on the other side of the paperwork, and often was. The money wasn't buying a woman either in most of these places. Read what it actually did. In Athens and Rome, it stayed hers in a real sense. It went home with her if the marriage ended, which made it her protection against being discarded. In England, the jointure ran the other way. It was the husband's family guaranteeing her an income if he died first. Across much of Africa, the cattle acknowledged what her family was losing when she left their fields. In a lot of societies, the transfer was her share of the inheritance, handed over early because a daughter got hers at the wedding. The payment could be protection, compensation, inheritance, or insurance depending on where you stood. What it always was, in every one of those forms, was stated. Marriage had a financial dimension nobody was required to pretend didn't exist. The love and the ledger sat in the same room, and looking at the ledger didn't insult the love. There's another way to throw all this out, and it deserves its strongest form. You'd say I went shopping through thousands of years and pulled out the places that fit, anecdotes with dates attached. Somewhere there's a civilization where none of this happened, and I walked quietly past it. Look at what these places had in common. Babylon and Renaissance Florence sit 3,000 years apart with no contact, no shared language, no shared religion, no shared currency, and no shared idea about almost anything a society can have ideas about. Athens ran on slaves and olive oil. Victorian England ran on coal and factories. India today runs on software exports and mobile banking. If the practice came from something local, a particular god, a particular legal tradition, a particular economy, then changing every local thing should have changed it. Every local thing did change, repeatedly, for 4 millennia. Something recognizably similar kept turning up on the other side. The reason sits underneath all of them, and it's plain enough to explain in half a minute. Ask where a household's food and money came from in these places. Much of Eurasia farmed with a plough, heavy soil, draft animals, and a blade that takes upper body strength to control. In many of those societies that favored male labor, so the fields ended up largely in the hands of husbands and sons. A wife in that setup ran the house and bore children, and she brought in little harvest under her own name. Her arrival tended to raise what the household spent without raising what it earned. Her family covered part of that gap with cash. That's a large part of it, and it's the part that got discussed at the table. You can test that because the test already ran thousands of times without anyone designing it. Across much of sub-Saharan Africa, farming was done with a hoe, and the hoeing was done largely by women. A wife there started producing food the week she arrived. Her own family was losing a worker, and her husband's family was gaining one. So the cattle walked the other direction, from his people to hers, counted out and negotiated in advance. The Zulu call it lobola. The negotiations still happen, and the animals are still counted one by one, out loud, by both families. Those two arrangements look like opposites, and people treat them as opposites. They're the same rule running in two directions. Whoever arrives adding more cost than income to the household tends to get subsidized on the way in. Whoever arrives adding more income than cost tends to get paid for. Across the societies anthropologists have studied, payment from the groom's side is the more common arrangement. The dowry regions line up closely with the plough regions. Both directions prove the same thing, which is why the inversion matters more than either arrangement on its own. These societies had already worked out what a marriage cost each side and settled up accordingly. You can call the next two before I get there. Ancient Egypt. Women held property under their own names, ran businesses, inherited directly, and sued in court on their own account. You already know which way the money moved. Egyptian marriage documents have the husband committing to maintain his wife and listing what he owes her if he walks away. She showed up with earning power, so there was no economic gap her family had to cover. Thailand, right now, walk through any market in Bangkok and count who runs the stalls. A Thai groom brings sinsod to the wedding, negotiated between the families beforehand, and a man who arrives short of the agreed figure generally doesn't get the wedding. Now run that rule forward through the last 150 years of your own civilization, because your grandparents lived through the biggest move it ever made. England let married women keep their own wages and property in 1870, then more completely in 1882. Before those laws, most of what a wife earned belonged to her husband the moment she earned it. Mississippi moved first in America in 1839, and the other states followed. Then came typewriters, telephones, factory floors, offices, university places, careers. Follow what that did to the math. One major reason the dowry made economic sense was that a wife could arrive as a net expense to the household she joined. Give her a wage of her own, and that stops being true. She isn't a cost being absorbed anymore. She's a second income walking in the door. The gap her father used to cover with silver closed on its own, so there was nothing left to compensate anybody for. And the dowry emptied out across the West. Nobody banned it in London or Chicago. Nobody had to campaign against it. It went the way any payment goes when the thing it was paying for stops existing. Here's where people jump to the wrong conclusion, though. The dowry disappearing did not mean marriage stopped costing anyone anything. It meant one specific gap closed. The rest of the bill stayed where it was, and some of it got bigger. A household still eats. A mortgage still runs 30 years. Children still cost what children cost, and on top of ordinary expense, a set of obligations got built that no Babylonian scribe would have recognized. Alimony, calculated by statute. Child support formulas that run off his income and adjust upward when it rises. Division of what was acquired during the marriage. Courts that keep those obligations live for years, sometimes decades, after the two people have stopped speaking. In many modern Western systems, his side of the arrangement got longer, more enforceable, and harder to exit than much of what Rome wrote down. Add it up, and the sum sitting on a married man in 2026 is arguably heavier than the sum sitting on a man in Hammurabi's Babylon. The clear difference is that the Babylonians' number was carved in public, on a stone, in the middle of the city. What actually went missing was the permission to say the number out loud. For 3,000 years, two families sat at a table and said the figure to each other's faces. Priests did it, notaries did it, solicitors did it in writing with witnesses. They talked about what each side owned, what each side would owe, what happened to all of it if he died, if she died, if the marriage ended badly. It was the respectable, adult, expected part of getting married, and a man who refused to discuss it would have been the strange one in the room. Now try that at a dinner table. Bring up what happens to the house if it ends. Ask what each side owns, what each side brings in, and what each side expects if it ends. Say out loud how many years of your income a bad ending would take. In most rooms in the modern West, that conversation gets heard as a lack of romance, as if raising the subject reveals something cold about you, or means you're already planning your exit. It's the same subject the notaries handled, and it gets a completely different reception. The bill is still on the table. Saying it out loud is what got embarrassing, and you already do the arithmetic anyway. You've done it lying awake, what the wedding runs, what the house runs, what a split would run, what you'd owe, and for how many years, what comes back the other way. Then you keep every bit of it behind your teeth, because you know exactly what you'd be called if you said it at dinner. Every father in this story said it at dinner. It was dinner. Two different men get called the same thing here, and the difference matters. A man afraid of commitment doesn't want to be tied to anyone. He avoids the conversation because the conversation might lead somewhere. A man doing the arithmetic wants to know the terms of the thing he's about to spend 30 years inside. He isn't avoiding the conversation. He's the only one in the room trying to have it. One of those men is running from a decision. The other is trying to make one properly. They get filed under the same word because from the outside, they both look like a man who hasn't proposed yet. From the inside, they have almost nothing in common, which is where this channel keeps landing. And tonight, it has thousands of years standing behind it. A lot of men right now are looking at that sum, seeing what comes back the other way, and declining. They get written up as a crisis, lonely, stunted, afraid of women. Some of them are doing the oldest respectable practice in the written record, pricing the thing before agreeing to it, and acting on the answer they get. Pricing it and walking away when the number doesn't work is the Babylonian move made in private. A scribe from 1750 BC would need about 4 seconds to follow it. Here's the one thing worth doing, and it comes straight out of everything above. Those families didn't negotiate because they were unromantic. They negotiated because they knew a marriage would run for decades and touch everything both households owned, and they wanted both sides walking in with their eyes open. You want the same thing they wanted, so put the number on the table out loud, not in your head at 2 in the morning, out loud to her in daylight. What you're taking on, over how many years, what it costs you if it ends, and what comes back the other way. Her side's answer is the real information. If the question itself gets treated as an insult, you've learned something before a court had to teach it to you. Fathers, scribes, priests, and solicitors put versions of that question in writing across centuries and continents before people got married. You're allowed to ask it about your own life. It used to be the wedding.